Chair recognizes the gentleman from Oldham 59.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Gentleman Todd, appreciate that explanation. I want to talk just very briefly about the impact of this tax on the bourbon industry. I think that everybody assumes, just like as we do with the horse industry, that we are entitled to be home to the bourbon industry. A lot of people believe that bourbon has to be made in Kentucky to be called bourbon. Absolutely not true. Bourbon doesn't even have to be bottled in Kentucky to be called Kentucky bourbon. Bourbon has to stay in Kentucky for 1 year and 1 day in a barrel to even be called Kentucky bourbon. It can then be put on a truck, shipped to anywhere else in the world, and still be called Kentucky bourbon. It is not our right to be the home of the bourbon industry, and we're seeing this more and more all the time. Over the past several years, Kentucky has continued to lose market share. Kentucky now has less than 3% of the distilled spirits licenses in the country. In 2012, we had 25% of those. In 2021, Kentucky had 30% of the distilling jobs, which dropped from 43% in 2009. Kentucky has fallen from 11th to 12th nationally in the number of distilleries in our state, behind Ohio, Florida, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina, who have moved ahead of us in recent years. Kentucky taxes alcohol more than any other state in the country. About 60% of every bottle of bourbon, the cost of that is taxes. $1.92 when it comes out of the still, 9% wholesale tax. Only 2 states charge a wholesale tax. Kentucky charges 9%, South Dakota charges 2%. It's also taxed at the, there's actually a case tax on that as well as sales tax at the retail level. These are business level decisions. I don't think anybody anticipates that the bourbon industry is suddenly going to leave Kentucky. It is simply not going to happen. It is Kentucky's heritage, and the distillers will continue to distill in Kentucky. I do believe that there is a barrier to entry of new startups. We have seen over the last several years that about 40% of the new startups in distilling are locating outside of Kentucky. New bourbon distilleries, about 40% of them locating outside of Kentucky. So we can see that this is a barrier to entry. It is also a disincentive to store product here. And again, it's simply a business level decision. It costs $4.50 every single year to store barrels in Kentucky. If they go to Indiana, aside from the toll, gentleman from Wayne, I'm sure you factored what that might be, but aside from the toll, there's no charge to store it in Indiana. Prior to 2014, when we created the tax credit on the state portion of it, many distilleries did house their bourbon out of state. They chose to move them back to take advantage of that tax credit. They no longer have the ability to take advantage of those, or to take those tax credits and take advantage of them. So they will are beginning to make those decisions about taking barrels out of state. They've just gotten a ruling in Tennessee that the regulation that Tennessee had that requires that rick houses be stored or only be built in counties adjacent to distilleries is not legal. So they can now move without paying a toll to Tennessee. They have bought land in Tennessee. They bought land in Indiana. Again, the distilleries are not going away. They're going to continue to make their bourbon here. But this will help cement ourselves as the bourbon capital of the world. And I believe it is reasonable. You know, a couple years ago, or several years ago, we saw a mass exodus in another industry, the horse industry, where we started seeing people moving mares to Indiana, to Pennsylvania, to California to take advantage of breeders' incentive programs. Once Kentucky was able to balance that, we've seen those mares come home. And we know that people make business decisions. I am as much of a Kentucky bred as anybody here, 7 generations. My family was actually in the state when it was Virginia. But when I had the opportunity to make a business decision about where to house my mares, I moved them to Indiana and California. Was not one of the brighter days of my life. But when we made changes to laws that made it more attractive, all my mayors have come back to Kentucky, except 2, and they will come back after they fold this year. So I do believe that this is purely a business level decision on their part. They have been great corporate citizens throughout much of Kentucky, and would urge passage to remove this anti-competitive barrel tax with this bill today. I would yield back to the gentleman from Todd.